In 1969, the engineer who put men on the moon was celebrated as one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. He was also a major in the SS. Those two facts existed simultaneously, in the same files, in the same government offices, for 24 years. No one was confused about this. No one had made a mistake. The people who processed his paperwork knew exactly who he was and exactly what they were doing with that information. They changed the date, not the man, not the record of what he had built or where he had built it, or who had built it alongside him, or rather, under him, in a tunnel 200 feet underground, where the dead were left in the corridors between shifts because there was no time to move them before production resumed. They changed a date on a form. 2 years, 1937 to 1939. That was enough. The story of the Apollo program is the story most Americans know best about what their country is capable of at its highest. It is a story of vision and engineering and sacrifice, and the particular kind of national will that decides, in the middle of a Cold War, that it will put a human being on the surface of another world within a decade, and then does it. That story is true. And it is also true that the rocket was built by a man who had requested concentration camp prisoners by name from SS administrators, who had stood in the tunnel at Nordhausen while those prisoners worked, who had held the rank of Sturmbannführer in an organization whose membership required a personal oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Both things are true. The country that celebrated one chose not to examine the other. That choice was not made by accident. It was made in writing, by named officials, in documents that are now declassified and sitting in the National Archives. And it was made with the full knowledge that it contradicted a direct presidential directive. And in 1984, when the Department of Justice finally opened the files that had been sitting in the Berlin Document Center since 1945, what they found changed everything about how this story ends. That's in Act 5. The moon landing happened. Everything else was managed. In June 1943, Heinrich Himmler traveled to a tunnel. Not a battlefield, not a command center. A tunnel. Carved into the Harz Mountains of central Germany, 200 feet underground, where daylight never reached and the air smelled of ammonia and concrete dust. He was there to approve something. According to SS records held at the National Archives, Record Group 242, Himmler personally authorized the expansion of V-2 rocket production at what would become the Mittelwerk factory. The workforce would be drawn entirely from the concentration camp at Dora.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Wernher von Braun was present for that visit. That detail doesn't appear in the standard biographies. It doesn't appear in the NASA commemorative volumes. It appears in von Braun's own SS personnel file, reference BDC SSO, which documents his presence at Nordhausen during the period of Himmler's inspection. He was there in his capacity as technical director of the V-2 program. He saw what the facility was. He saw who was building his rockets. The prisoners at Dora were not laborers in any conventional sense. They were concentration camp inmates, transferred from Buchenwald, later from across occupied Europe, working 12-hour shifts underground with no natural light, inadequate food, and almost no medical care. The tunnels were not yet finished when production began. Men slept in the same corridors where they worked, on the bare rock floor next to the machines. They died faster than they could be replaced. According to historian Michael Neufeld, von Braun's most authoritative biographer, in his 2007 work, Von Braun, Dreamer of Space, Engineer of War, an estimated 20,000 prisoners died at Dora Mittelbau over the course of the war. Starvation, exhaustion, Execution for sabotage, real or suspected. 20,000. The V-2 rockets those men built killed approximately 9,000 people in London, Antwerp, and other Allied cities. The weapon killed fewer people than its own construction did. This is not a footnote. This is the foundation of the program that became NASA's launch capability. The Saturn V, the rocket that put men on the moon, was a direct engineering descendant of the V-2, developed by the same team, led by the same man, operating under American contracts instead of SS ones. Von Braun knew what DORA was. He visited the facility at least once after Himmler's inspection. Neufeld documents this, and requested workers directly from the camp administration on at least 2 occasions. The requests were granted. The prisoners arrived. The production continued. After the war, von Braun described his visits to DORA as distressing. He said he had no authority over camp conditions. He said he was a scientist, not a guard. The SS records list his rank as Sturmbannführer, Major. He had joined the SS in November 1940. He was not a passive observer inside a system. He held rank inside it. And then there's a name that doesn't appear in any NASA press release. Mittelwerk GmbH. The story America tells about its space program is one of the great origin myths of the 20th century. And it earns that status. Whatever else is true, the achievement is real. On July 16, 1969, a 363-foot rocket left a launch pad in Florida carrying 3 men and enough fuel to escape the gravitational pull of Earth. 8 days later, 2 of those men walked on the moon. 600 million people watched on television. It remains, by most measures, the most technically complex thing human beings have ever done. The man most responsible for building the machine that made it possible was Wernher von Braun. By 1969, von Braun was a celebrity in the specific way that mid-century America produced celebrities: a face on magazine covers, a guest on Walt Disney's television program, the subject of a Hollywood film. He was tall, handsome, spoke English with a slight accent that made him sound distinguished rather than foreign. He had the gift of making the impossible sound inevitable. When he described rockets, people believed him. The official biography runs cleanly. Born in Germany in 1912, von Braun showed an early obsession with space travel. He joined the German Rocket Society as a teenager, came under the influence of Hermann Oberth, one of the founding theorists of astronautics, and by his mid-20s was leading the German Army's rocket development program at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. The V-2 was the result. The world's first long-range ballistic missile, first launched successfully in October 1942. When Germany collapsed in 1945, von Braun made a calculated decision. He surrendered to American forces, deliberately, having moved his team westward to avoid capture by the Soviets. He brought with him technical documents, engineering drawings, and 125 of his top scientists. The Americans accepted the offer immediately. This was Operation Paperclip. The name came from the paperclips used to attach new biographical summaries to the scientists' dossiers. Summaries that replaced the originals on file with the State Department. The operation was run by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA, a small interagency body with significant authority and almost no public oversight. What the official record confirms, and what no one thought to check for nearly 3 decades, is a detail buried in the same personnel files that everyone cited when praising von Braun's contributions. Von Braun's application listed his Nazi Party membership date as 1939. The records were considered complete. The vetting was considered thorough. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were processed through Paperclip between 1945 and 1959. They were given security clearances, government salaries, and in many cases, a path to American citizenship. They were given new files. By the mid-1950s, von Braun was leading the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville, Alabama. When NASA was created in 1958, he moved with his team into the new agency. In 1960, he became director of what would become the Marshall Space Flight Center. The Saturn V was his project from the beginning. The rocket worked. That much is not in dispute. The question that nobody asked publicly, not in 1969, not at the launch, not during the celebrations, was a simpler one. The official file said 1939. The SS records said 1937. Secret. That's the operative word. Not classified, not restricted. Secret. There is a difference, and the people who ran Operation Paperclip knew exactly what it was. Classified information can be reviewed, appealed, eventually released. A secret, in the way the JIOA used the word, is something that was never supposed to exist in the official record at all. The date discrepancy in von Braun's file was not a clerical error. In September 1947, the JIOA's director, Bosquet Webb, wrote an internal memo, now declassified, held at the National Archives, in which he described the security reports on the Paperclip scientists as a problem. Not because the scientists were dangerous, because the reports were honest. The existing dossiers, compiled by the State Department and the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, documented Nazi Party memberships, SS ranks, and in several cases, direct involvement in war crimes. Webb's concern was that if those reports reached the State Department's review board, the import requests would be denied. His solution was to have the reports rewritten. Not corrected, rewritten. The incriminating sections were removed or rephrased. Party memberships were listed as involuntary or nominal. SS ranks were omitted entirely. In von Braun's case, his party membership date was moved forward by 2 years, from 1937 to 1939. His SS rank of Sturmbannführer disappeared from the summary. His presence at Dora during the Himmler inspection was not mentioned. The new file described him as a scientist who had been compelled to work for the Nazi regime under duress. He had joined the party voluntarily in 1937 at the age of 25. He had applied for SS membership in 1940 and been accepted. These were not passive affiliations. The SS was not a professional association. Membership required an explicit oath of personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Von Braun took that oath. The document exists. It is held at the Berlin Document Center, cross-referenced in Neufeld's biography, and independently verified by Linda Hunt in her 1991 investigative work, Secret Agenda, which remains the most comprehensive document-based account of Paperclip's internal mechanics. President Truman had issued an explicit directive. No one with a history of Nazi activity, his words, was to be admitted under the program. The JIOA was aware of this directive. Webb's memo acknowledges it directly. The solution was not to argue with the directive. The solution was to produce files that made the directive inapplicable. If the file said the scientist had no Nazi history, the directive did not apply. The directive was not violated. It was simply made irrelevant by the documents that preceded it. This is not bureaucratic corner-cutting. This is deliberate falsification of federal records, executed at the institutional level, with the knowledge of senior military and intelligence officials. The FBI objected. J. Edgar Hoover, not a man known for excessive moral scruple, wrote to the State Department in 1947 expressing concern that the Paperclip program was importing individuals who should by rights be facing prosecution at Nuremberg, not receiving government contracts in Alabama. His objection was noted. The program continued. The Department of Justice objected. Their concern was on record by 1948. The program continued. At least 15 of the scientists brought in under Paperclip had direct, documented involvement in the use of slave labor at facilities connected to the V2 program.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Peripheral involvement, not awareness. Direct operational responsibility. Arthur Rudolph had been operations director at Mittelwerk. He oversaw production schedules. He signed paperwork authorizing the use of Dora prisoners. He became program manager of the Saturn V. He stood on the same launch pad as von Braun in 1969. There's a memo, written by Truman's own legal counsel in 1948, after the State Department finally received the original, unredacted, dossiers on several Paperclip scientists. The memo describes what the JIOA had done in precise, unambiguous language. It recommends that the matter be reviewed at the presidential level. There is no evidence the memo reached Truman's desk. There is evidence it was intercepted at the level of the Joint Chiefs. The memo reached the office of the Secretary of Defense. What happened to it there is documented in the declassified records of the JIOA, released under the Freedom of Information Act and analyzed in detail by Linda Hunt in Secret Agenda, 1991, and by Annie Jacobson in Operation Paperclip, 2014. The latter drawing on over 65,000 declassified government documents obtained directly from the National Archives. The memo was not acted upon. Not suppressed in the dramatic sense. No one ordered it burned. No one denied its existence. It was filed, acknowledged, and then the program continued exactly as before. Because by 1948, the strategic calculation had already been made at a level above legal counsel and above the State Department's review process. The calculation was this. The Soviet Union had also captured German rocket scientists. Not as many, and not the best ones. Von Braun's team had made sure of that by surrendering west. But enough. The Cold War was not yet 2 years old, and it was already an arms race. In that context, the question of whether von Braun had joined the Nazi Party in 1937 or 1939 was, to the Joint Chiefs, not a legal question. It was an irrelevance. Jacobson's reconstruction of the internal decision-making process, sourced directly from JIOA administrative records, shows that by late 1947, the program had effectively been placed beyond civilian legal review. The scientists were assets. Assets are not prosecuted. Assets are managed. The word used internally, across multiple memos, was exploit, not employ. Not hire, exploit. According to a 1945 JIOA directive obtained by Jacobson, the stated objective of Paperclip was to exploit German scientific and technical expertise for American military advantage. The language was deliberate. It reflected a view of these men not as individuals with legal histories, but as resources. The same view, it must be noted, that the SS had applied to the prisoners at Dora. The irony was not lost on everyone at the time. It was simply overruled. And this is where it gets interesting. Because the cover story, the one about scientists acting under duress, about nominal party memberships and reluctant compliance, was not just used to get the men into the country. It became the permanent public record. It was the version taught in schools. It was the version NASA used in its official histories. It was the version von Braun himself repeated in interviews and memoirs for the rest of his life. He was very good at it. In a 1971 interview with journalist Erich Berghaus, published in Wernher von Braun, 1976, von Braun described his SS membership as essentially ceremonial. He said he had been pressured to join, that refusal would have meant the end of his rocket program, that he had no operational role within the organization. The SS records contradict this on every point. His membership was voluntary. His rank was substantive. Sturmbannführer is not an honorary title. And his operational role was direct. He attended facility inspections. He submitted prisoner labor requests. He corresponded with SS administrators about production targets. These documents were not secret by 1971. They had been available at the Berlin Document Center since the early 1950s. Any journalist with a research budget and a flight to West Germany could have read them. None of the major American outlets did. This is not entirely surprising. By 1971, von Braun had just overseen the moon landing. He was, in the American imagination, one of the architects of the greatest achievement in human history. The Berlin Document Center was not where you went to check the biography of a national hero. But someone had checked. In 1984, the Office of Special Investigations, the DOJ unit responsible for Nazi war crimes cases, opened a file on Arthur Rudolph. The investigation drew directly on Mittelwerk production records, SS administrative documents, and survivor testimony from Dora Mittelbau. The conclusion was unambiguous. Rudolph had been personally responsible for conditions that constituted crimes against humanity under the standards established at Nuremberg. Rudolph was given a choice. He could face prosecution, or he could renounce his American citizenship and leave the country voluntarily. He left. He flew to Hamburg. He was never tried. He had spent 39 years in the United States. He had received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. He had been celebrated at the same ceremonies as von Braun, stood on the same stages, accepted the same applause. When he landed in Hamburg, the applause stopped. No one in Washington made a statement. Jean-Pierre Drech was 19 years old when he arrived at Dora. He was French. He had been arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 for resistance activity and transferred to Buchenwald, then to the tunnels at Nordhausen. He worked on the V2 assembly line for 14 months. He survived, one of the minority who did. In 1969, Drech watched the Apollo 11 launch on a television set in Paris. He recognized the rocket. Not metaphorically. He recognized the engineering, the engine configuration, the staging sequence. He had spent 14 months assembling the machine that became that machine, in a tunnel where the dead were stacked in the corridors because there was no time to remove them before the next shift began. He was not invited to Cape Canaveral. None of the survivors were. Von Braun watched the launch from the VIP viewing area. He wept. By every account, the tears were genuine. He had dreamed of this since he was a teenager, reading science fiction in Berlin. The dream was real. The rocket worked. In the tunnels of Dora, 20,000 people had made sure of that. Their names are on a memorial in Nordhausen. None of them are on any building at NASA. Von Braun died in 1977. His obituary in the New York Times ran to 32 paragraphs. Dora Mittelbau appears in paragraph 29, in a single sentence, described as a facility where rockets were produced under difficult conditions. 20,000 dead. Difficult conditions. Operation Paperclip officially ended in 1959. The template it created did not. What Paperclip established, with full institutional knowledge and deliberate legal engineering, was a precedent. That strategic advantage could override accountability. That the biographical record of an asset could be managed rather than examined. And that the agencies responsible for vetting could, when sufficiently motivated, produce whatever conclusion was operationally convenient. This precedent was not an aberration. It became a methodology. In the decades following Paperclip, The CIA ran parallel programs importing former Nazi and fascist intelligence operatives into anti-Soviet networks across Europe and Latin America. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon, responsible for the torture and deportation of thousands of French Jews, was employed by U.S. Army counterintelligence from 1947 to 1951. Then helped to escape to Bolivia via a rat line that U.S. intelligence facilitated. This was documented by the DOJ's own investigation in 1983. The report, authored by Special Prosecutor Alan Ryan, concluded that U.S. Army officers had knowingly concealed Barbie's identity from French war crimes investigators for 4 years. The mechanism was identical to Paperclip's. Identify the asset, assess the utility, manage the file. The pattern appears again in Operation Condor, the U.S.-supported network of South American military dictatorships that disappeared an estimated 60,000 people between 1975 and 1983. It appears in the CIA's relationships with Manuel Noriega, with Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, with the Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s. In each case, the internal calculation followed the same logic that Bosquet-Webb articulated in his 1947 memo. The strategic benefit outweighs the legal and moral cost, and the file can be managed accordingly. This is not conspiracy. It is policy. The distinction matters. A conspiracy is hidden, fragile, dependent on silence. What Paperclip demonstrated is that certain decisions do not need to be hidden. They need only to be bureaucratically managed, placed in the correct files, described in the correct language, and kept at a sufficient distance from public accountability. The scientists were not smuggled in. They were processed. They had paperwork. They had security clearances. They had NASA Distinguished Service Medals. The machinery of legitimacy was not bypassed. It was used. There is a direct line from the tunnels of Nordhausen to the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, and it runs through a filing cabinet in Washington where someone replaced one set of documents with another and signed their name to the substitution. That person was not acting alone. They were acting on behalf of an institution that had made a calculation, and the calculation had been approved at the highest levels available. The moon landing happened. That is true. And it matters. And nothing about Paperclip makes it less true. But the moon landing also happened because 20,000 people died in a tunnel. And the man who ran that tunnel was given a medal and a press pass and a seat in the VIP section. And the question of accountability was filed somewhere it would not be found for 30 years. Arthur Rudolph was investigated in 1984, 40 years after Dora. The survivors who testified in that investigation were in their 60s and 70s by then. Some had already died. The testimony they gave was specific, documented, and corroborated by the SS records that had been sitting in the Berlin Document Center since 1945. The records were always there. No one had been assigned to look. Someone made that calculation, that the utility of these men was worth more than the accounting of what they had done. The question is not whether that calculation was made. It is documented. The question is whether we are still making versions of it, in different contexts, with different names in the files. And whether, 40 years from now, someone will be sitting in an archive reading the records that are sitting there right now. There is a photograph taken at Cape Canaveral on July 16, 1969. Von Braun is in it. He is wearing a suit. He is smiling. Behind him, the Saturn V is still on the pad, minutes before ignition. The people around him are smiling too. Engineers, officials, administrators. Everyone in the photograph is looking at the rocket. It is a photograph of genuine pride. That is not in question. What is in question is what pride costs when it is built on a foundation that was deliberately obscured. Not forgotten, obscured. There is a difference. Forgetting is passive. What the JIOA did in 1947 was active. They looked at the foundation, assessed it, and decided that the structure they wanted to build was more important than the honesty of what lay beneath it. They were not wrong about the rocket. They may not have been wrong about the Cold War calculation either. That is a harder argument, and reasonable people can make it. The Soviet Union was real. The arms race was real. The strategic stakes were genuine. If von Braun and his team had gone to Moscow instead of Alabama, the history of the 20th century would look different, and not necessarily better. But that argument, however valid, was never put to the public. The public was given a different story, a cleaner one, a story about a visionary scientist who dreamed of the stars and helped America get there. The story was not entirely false. It was simply missing 20,000 names. And here is the thing about missing names. They do not disappear because the file was rewritten. They accumulate. They wait. Jean-Pierre Drek watched the launch on television in Paris and recognized the rocket. The survivors of Dora Mittelbau did not need a declassified memo to know what had been built in those tunnels and who had built it. They knew. They had always known. The gap was not between what happened and what was remembered. It was between what was remembered and what was said out loud, officially, in the documents and the ceremonies and the obituaries. That gap is where institutional memory goes to die. Every generation inherits a version of history that was edited by the generation before it. Not always maliciously. Sometimes pragmatically. Sometimes, as in Paperclip's case, with the explicit awareness that the edit was being made and the deliberate intention that it would not be undone. The scientists were useful. The usefulness was the argument. The argument was accepted. We went to the moon. We also built a system, legal, bureaucratic, institutional, for deciding that certain facts about certain people could be managed rather than confronted. That system did not retire when Paperclip ended. It adapted. It found new applications. It is, in various forms, still in use. The question worth sitting with is not whether von Braun was a genius. He was. It is not whether the moon landing was an achievement. It was. The question is what we normalize when we decide that the foundation doesn't need to be examined, that the structure is impressive enough to justify whatever is beneath it. Every institution that has ever committed a documented wrong has made that argument. Most of them were also building something real. If Operation Paperclip's files were falsified at the institutional level, and the program ran for 14 years before anyone looked closely enough to object, what else, right now, is sitting in a cabinet with the wrong date on the cover page? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover the financial system that was designed in secret by the men it was supposed to regulate, and why the meeting that created it was never supposed to be found. The rocket reached the moon. The tunnel is still there.